This is a little set of videos about Glorantha, the famous role-playing setting, and its associated games, which are RuneQuest and HeroQuest, at the very least. And why am I talking about it? You will find fervent opinions everywhere. And so I'm doing this because people have been known to come to me specifically to ask when they're frustrated. And people get frustrated because the setting has this very long history and seems also to make no sense in terms of additions. And every time you look, there seems to be another addition. And if you're directed to a website that's this insane amount of high jargon information, and not to be too cagey about it, the internet discourse is deeply opinionated and can give an arrival a pretty negative experience. So I apparently have drawn the attention of people more than once to come up and say, can you just smooth this out for me and explain, because you're all into this stuff, so maybe you can help. Well, here I go. It has 3 parts. And the first part has to do with maybe the most boring, which is the publication history. What I'm saying here isn't going to be as detailed as what you can find in the attached document. Glorantha predates role-playing as we currently know it, going back to the mid-60s, as a personal creation and a social topic of conversation by Greg Stafford on the coast of California. And so it's there among a certain subculture. When role-playing kicks in, it begins actually in gaming as the subject of 2 board games called White Bear and Red Moon and Nomad Gods. So RuneQuest, the role-playing game, was produced first in 1978. Okay, so let's talk about that phase of RuneQuest, which is pretty much, that and the 2 board games are pretty much the gaming medium for Glorantha. And that's where a lot more material gets developed, both by Stafford and by other people. So what do we find? First of all, the so-called first edition, it was a very brief publication. And then, as was often the case in those days, and then collectively over the next few years, you have a bunch of things that we call second edition. It didn't have second edition on the cover. It's completely retroactive label. Any fair-minded, assessment would simply put all of it, including that very first publication, into one big first generation RuneQuest category. So what also you should know is a couple of different expressions. I bought it as a book, and other people bought it as a box with the same document as a monocolor book in it with supplements and things. So the objects that you may have picked up are different. And also there was soon a Games Workshop publication in the UK with a different cover. And so people in those parts encountered RuneQuest, same text in terms of rules and things, through that publication. All right, so that's second edition. People call it RQ2. So it includes a lot of interesting stuff, and was very much the college game for a lot of people. And one of the important ideas, which was heavily implied and was even made explicit, I think, a couple of times later, was that the game was very open to user-based development. That if you had good ideas and that if you wanted to play a lot and you came up with a bunch of setting material, that you, whether it becomes canon or not, you see, people weren't really using that word. It was certainly available for consideration for publication, which is what a lot of role-playing companies did. And people seem to take that very seriously. One of the members of the company in question, the Chaosium, Sandy Peterson, produced through this kind of effort a remarkable document or product called Troll Pack, So that sort of set the gold standard for, wow, if you play Glorantha stuff and you make stuff up, I mean, you add to the world. It becomes bigger and better known. The idea that everybody was literally exploring a single Glorantha, sort of an actual imagined place through the process of play. Whether anybody really said that out loud, I don't know. Whether it was deeply felt, I do know. People felt that way very strongly. And so the creative work of play was often thought of as a discovery, and not only that, but a public discovery, something for other people to see that you had discovered. So you kind of have this degree of kind of almost mythic investment in this topic. Zines, articles, all sorts of, the APAs, all sorts of things got rolling very quickly where everybody's talking to each other about it. Well, with that happening, we have a different phase of publication to look at. And this was when RuneQuest was licensed to Avalon Hill in the mid-'80s. And Avalon Hill put out a very different product that actually didn't have the setting of Glorantha in it. So it was much more of a, sort of a generic fantasy world rules pack. They actually made a setting for it called Fantasy Earth, which was extremely Western European in many ways. And they repurposed a lot of the products to sort of de-Gloranthize them. And so that whole line of original Avalon Hill product was, had its own identity. Now, before I go on, and I hope I'm not going to be too terribly confusing, this whole discussion is rife with footnotes. The game system that RuneQuest used also had its own name, which is Basic Role-Playing. And very early, the Chaosium offered Basic Role-Playing as something you could use to make games. And it wasn't really an open license as such, but it was available for you to use in some negotiated fashion. There were a lot of games produced this way, particularly in Europe. It's quite a big deal. BRP is its own thing. So I just want to drop that footnote, move on. We'll bump it all the way up into the mid-'90s, or the early 90s, which is a completely different world. The early internet is starting to boom. What seems to be kind of breaking down at that point is this notion of Glorantha as a single place. You see, the original Glorantha presentation was a fairly small amount of the fantasy world, and the idea that you could fill in gaps in the history, that you could go off to a different geographic area and talk about what was there, develop what may have been a single tossed off comment in the original text, and you end up with all sorts of development. People were feeling very strongly about this and defending their different interpretations. Some of the material is philosophically genuinely, discussable, and people were taking different positions about it. All sorts of different factions were beginning to form, especially when you start getting websites as nodes of contribution and opinion makers, people with very strong views who were willing to put in a lot of investment into presenting and recruiting to those views in internet terms.